They say she stood beneath a tapestry of stars, not to pray, but to choose. The iron cages were not yet soaked in blood. The dogs had not yet been fed, but the scent of what was coming lingered in the night air like burnt velvet. She did not cry. Queens don't cry. They appoint executioners, then sip wine. But that night, she watched. The fire was not meant to cleanse. It was meant to brand. The priest who anointed her enemies whispered blessings with trembling hands, not to the condemned, but to the queen who ordered it. He said, "Forgive me." She said nothing. Birds flew from the rafters before the screaming began, as if the sky itself refused to bear witness. One man begged. One man defied. One simply laughed. None were buried. Their bodies were gifts to the beasts, each limb, each eye, each final gasp an offering not to justice, but to control. And when the feast was done, Queen Isabella ordered the blood washed not from the ground, but from her shoes. Not because she feared God, but because she knew history would forget. And so it did. Until now. They called her Isabella the She-Wolf. But even that name was too kind. Wolves kill to feed. She killed to be remembered. Before the crown, before the blood. She was a girl born into stone, French stone, cold and ceremonial. She learned early that love meant nothing unless it came with a treaty. Her father gave her hand to a man who could barely lift his own sword, Edward, a king by title, but not by fire. She watched him kneel to his favorites, while England whispered behind closed doors, not about policy, about perversion, about Piers Gaveston, about Hugh Despenser. She listened. She remembered. She waited. When her son was born, she saw her second chance, not to be queen, to be more. She learned silence as a weapon, smiles as daggers. She kissed the child, then plotted with mercenaries. Not for love, never for love, but for the stage. Power is theater, and Isabella became its director. When she returned to England with an army at her back, they didn't see a woman. They saw a reckoning. Kings were dragged from beds. Favorites were disemboweled. Her husband, the king, was forced to abdicate, and she didn't flinch. She watched it all with the same eyes she wore as a child in the French court, wide, cold, calculating. This is not the story of a scorned woman. It is the story of a woman who learned to bite before she could speak. She once wore silks. Now she wore silence. And when the screams began in the courtyard, when the dogs were unleashed, when flesh split like fruit, she didn't turn away. She watched until the bones stopped twitching, until her enemies were erased. And only then did she smile. It began with a whisper behind a curtain, the kind of whisper that changes nations. Isabella no longer knocked on doors. She opened them. Inside was a world rotting beneath the crown, not a kingdom, but a kennel. Her husband, King Edward II, had surrounded himself with flatterers and parasites, men whose loyalty could be bought with trinkets and flesh. At court, the air grew thicker with each indulgence, with each elevation of Hugh Despenser, the king's favored shadow. Lands were seized, nobles humiliated, and Isabella, once the queen, now little more than an ornament, watched herself vanish in mirrors. Her titles remained, but her reflection no longer bowed. When Despenser insulted her before the court, he expected a reaction. She gave none. Instead, she held the silence, like a blade yet to be drawn. The humiliation was not sudden. It was methodical. Her children were taken from her. Her letters were intercepted. Even her chambers were violated, searched for treason by those who had already written her sentence. But the mistake they made was simple. They thought she would break. She did not. She disappeared in plain sight. While England mocked her, she courted France. Her brother, Charles IV, gave her shelter. In his court, she was not a widow in waiting, she was a strategist. Wrapped in widow's silk, there, she met Roger Mortimer, a man with a scarred past and a future carved in treason. They whispered by candlelight, the language of betrayal more intimate than love. While Edward grew paranoid and Despenser crueler, Isabella built an army, not with swords, but with promises. She promised the barons revenge. She promised the people relief. She promised her son, the young Prince Edward, a throne not soaked in shame. And when she landed on English soil with troops behind her and her son beside her, she wore no armor. She wore the same expression she had worn at her wedding, poised, unreadable, terrifying in its stillness. Towns opened their gates without a fight. Nobles fell to their knees. Despenser fled, but not far enough. They caught him with blood still under his nails. He begged, as all cowards do. Isabella watched as he was dragged through the streets, his body torn open. Entrails burned before his still living eyes. Edward the King was cornered like a dog. He whimpered. He surrendered. They stripped him of his crown, his dignity, and finally, his name. Now just Edward, the prisoner. Now just a man. They placed him in Berkeley Castle, where the walls were thick and the guards were deaf. There are letters, perhaps forged, that describe what came next. A red-hot poker, an orifice, a silence so perfect it split the stone. No screams, no blood spilled, only the smell. But Isabella said nothing. She needed no confessions. She ruled as regent beside Mortimer, and for a moment, England belonged to her. She issued decrees with the confidence of kings, but power is a mirror that cracks from within. Mortimer, once her weapon, grew bold. He signed orders without her. He sat in council with her son, the boy King Edward III, and spoke as if Isabella were not there. Rumors spread again, this time not of lovers, but of control, of a queen who ruled through seduction and fear. Her own son began to doubt. The boys she had carried through exile now whispered behind her back. She tried to ignore it. She reminded him of her sacrifices, of his crown, of the blood she spilled so he could wear it. He nodded, but the nod came with a knife. Mortimer was arrested first, dragged from his bed in the night. He died screaming, hanged like a thief. Isabella was spared, not because they loved her, because they feared what she might become in death. So they locked her away, not in a dungeon, but in a palace of stone and memory. There, surrounded by tapestries too heavy to breathe through, she wandered halls that echoed her own name. She was no longer queen. She was mother, widow, shadow. And yet she smiled, because the fear remained, because the scent of dogs still haunted the court, because she knew they might erase her title, but they would never forget the silence she wielded like a sword. She embroidered tapestries, she lit candles, she read scriptures, but the nuns who watched her swore they heard her talking at night, not to God, but to ghosts. She spoke of fire, of entrails, of Despenser's eyes boiling in his skull. She laughed, sometimes, and sometimes she simply stared. When she died, they buried her in robes of penitence, but her fingers were stiff, curled inward like claws, as if even in death, she refused to let go. They say her tomb is peaceful, adorned with lilies, but the ground above it never grew grass, only weeds, thick, choked, red-veined. And when the wind howls through the nearby trees, villagers still say the dogs answer, not the dogs of flesh, the dogs of memory, the ones she loosed with a smile, the ones that tore history into silence. There was no pyre for her, no iron stake, no roaring crowd watching the skin peel from her bones. Isabella did not die in flames. Her death was quieter, more insidious, and far more suited to the woman who had built her power on silence. She was not executed, not in body. But they killed her anyway. Slowly, deliberately. Each day, a ritual. Each hour, a reminder. The queen who once ordered men dismembered and fed to beasts now sat at a window she was not allowed to open, staring at gardens she could never touch. Her palace had become her cage, and her attendants, young, frightened, instructed not to ask questions, tiptoed past her as if she were a shrine to something dangerous. She aged not in years, but in layers. Her hair, once coiled in gold, hung limp like winter vines. Her hands, which once signed death warrants with perfect precision, now trembled over beads and pages. But her eyes remained unchanged, the two mirrors without warmth, the same eyes that had watched her husband stripped and her lover hanged, the same eyes that never blinked when dogs tore into flesh. They tried to erase her with comforts, soft robes, warm food, prayers, but she saw it, the fear in their kindness, the poison hidden in mercy. They wanted her tame, small, forgotten, so they surrounded her with symbols of regret crosses, psalms, candlelight, but the wax always melted too fast, and the prayers never reached her. She did not repent. She remembered. Every scream, every betrayal, every laugh carved into a dying man's throat, and though her tongue grew quiet, her memory screamed for her. They say she began speaking to the walls, but the truth is, she never stopped speaking to history, to the men who thought a palace was a coffin, to the ghosts who still bled beneath her fingernails. Her moments of silence became acts of defiance. When the priest came to offer last rites, she stared at the crucifix and asked why it had never answered her mother. He said nothing. She closed her eyes and laughed. Her death came not as a thunderclap, but as a closing door. She did not struggle. She exhaled, as if tired of pretending to be mortal. Her last breath was said to be quiet, but the maid who found her swore the curtains had moved without wind, and the dogs outside howled before the bell rang. They washed her body, but her skin would not warm. They combed her hair, but it snapped like frostbitten grass. They dressed her in royal fabric, but it hung limp, as if the thread itself mourned. Her fingers were curled inward, not in pain, but in possession, as if even in death, she refused to give back what she had taken. No autopsy, no public mourning. Her funeral was swift, almost hidden. No crowds, no processions, just whispers. The same way she had built her reign. They buried her in a tomb lined with velvet, beneath a stone so heavy it took 10 men to lower it. Not to honor her, to contain her. Even in death, they feared what might rise. But something did. Not her body, not her name. The ritual did not end with burial, it began. Because each time a dog howled in the night, each time a noble woman stood too tall or a queen refused to kneel, they remembered Isabella. Not her smile, her silence, that terrifying, watchful quiet. The kind of silence that precedes cruelty, the kind of silence that survives history. They thought her gone, but her death was not an end. It was a seed, buried deep in stone and silence, and now it grows in shadows, in rumors, in the unspoken. She does not need a monument. Her legacy is made of ghosts. They buried her quietly, but her shadow refused to stay underground. Long after her breath ceased, her presence persisted, not in the words of kings, but in what they refused to say. Official records fell silent. Her name was not struck through, it was sidestepped, like a room no one entered anymore. Queen Isabella, the she-wolf, the regent, the widow, the mother of the king, the woman who broke a monarch with a whisper and fed his corpse to silence. Her son, Edward III, sat on the throne she had won for him, but he never spoke her name in public again. Not once. His reign prospered. Battles were won, enemies vanquished, But there were nights when his scribes caught him staring into nothing, lips moving without sound. Perhaps he was counting debts that could never be paid. Perhaps he was listening for the footsteps of a woman who walked softer than guilt, but left deeper wounds. The court changed its decor, banished her colors, removed her tapestries, but none of them could cleanse the scent that lingered. The servants claimed the palace still echoed with her heels, sharp and measured, like a judgment walking toward you. Clerics refused to speak of her. Bishops who had once bowed before her now preached against excess and sin, but never named her. Their sermons were filled with warnings, but their eyes betrayed fear, not righteousness. It was not God they dreaded, it was memory. And memory, when attached to a woman like Isabella, was a blade with no hilt. You could not wield it without bleeding. So they buried her again, this time in silence, this time in forgetting. But the land remembered. The villages whispered that the flowers around her tomb grew wrong, too red, too fast. A gardener was found weeping, hands shaking, claiming he had seen the lilies shift toward the moon on their own. The dogs, once symbols of loyalty, became omens. Packs roamed near the castle, ruins where her enemies had died, circling at dusk as if waiting for her return. Children were warned, do not wander past the trees at night, the queen's beasts walk there. And when fires burn too fast or winds change direction suddenly, old women crossed themselves and whispered, "She watches." In France, her homeland, they called her a traitor, but no one dared write her out completely. Even her enemies feared the silence that might follow. Because Isabella's aftershock was not in rebellion, but in stillness, the way a stone dropped in a lake ripples long after it sinks, the way fear sits in the room after the threat has left. The chronicles of her age mention her less and less as time passes, yet the gaps in the parchment scream louder than the ink. Historians debate her. Was she a monster, a mother, a monarch, or a myth? But the ones who get too close, who ask the wrong questions, find themselves dreaming of hounds, of teeth, of velvet robes stained in blood. Something lingers. The air thickens around her story. Archives go missing. Pages are scorched. A priest in Canterbury who dared to call her damned collapsed in the pulpit mid-sermon, mouth foaming, eyes locked wide. They buried him next to a dog that had followed him for weeks. No one claimed the animal. No one touched it. Over time, a pattern emerged. Women who refused obedience were labeled wolves. Queens who showed ambition were warned of Isabella's fate. The silence around her became weaponized, a lesson for others. Do not look too long at power. Do not speak when kings falter. Do not remember the she-wolf. But they did. In poems, in paintings, in masks worn during court masks, where noble women played the villain with silver fangs and unreadable eyes. She returned in fragments not as herself, but as something deeper, as archetype, as warning, as curse, and still, no one spoke her name. Her son aged, victories dulled, but on his final night, Edward III reportedly called out not for God, nor his wife, nor his knights. He whispered one word. They say mother, just once, and then silence. The same silence she gave the world. The same silence that remains in the old stone floors of the tower where she once walked. They cleaned the blood, polished the steel, repainted the chambers, but the walls remember. They all do. The smell of hot iron never truly leaves. Nor does the memory of a queen who did not scream, only watched, who did not command, only waited, who did not beg, only smiled. History moved on, yes, but with a limp. They say her ashes were scattered, but no one can say where. The wind that carried her never spoke again. Rouen silence remains not a silence of peace, but of held breath. Stones don't bleed. Yet something stains the walls where no paint peels. Her name is not chiseled in monuments, but carved into the space history avoids. No verdict, no apology, no acknowledgement, just echoes. Her enemies are long buried, their crimes forgotten, their screams erased, but the absence she left is louder than their legacy. Every kingdom that feared her wrote her out. Every priest who blessed her feared what blessing truly meant, because she did not vanish. She multiplied, in fear, in ritual, in the way people lower their voices when mentioning queens who dare too much. She is not a ghost. Ghosts need closure. She's a wound that never scabs, a whisper that reshapes the room, a memory that walks without footsteps. And if you stand too long at the ruins where dogs once fed and banners once burned, you might hear it not a sound, but a pause in the air, thick and breathless. That's her, still watching, not gone, just waiting for history to blink.